Wireless connection. Oh, there we are. All right, hello everybody. So, welcome to another Monday night Doc Talk. And the topic tonight, since last week we covered a few issues regarding thyroid health. We covered basic stuff about things you can do in general to keep the thyroid healthy, certain foods that are helpful for that. Particularly the iodine-containing foods, not too much, not too little, especially when you're eating lots of very good, healthy foods, such as soy and broccoli and the other goiterogenic foods that they're called. Anywho, reference back to last week's video for more about that topic. So last week I also talked about hypothyroidism. So hypo is essentially meaning low. So in other words, when we're talking about thyroid function, we're talking about the worker bee, whether the worker is doing its job and being normal, whether it's not putting out enough thyroid hormones, or whether it's overactive and hyperthyroid. So last week we talked about when the worker's slacking off. This week we'll talk about what happens when the worker goes haywire. And so one of the things I always like to bring to mind is the link between foods that are popular or commonly eaten in the United States, which is where I happen to live, and the impact of those foods on such things as autoimmune disease. So, hyperthyroidism is most commonly Graves' disease. There's a few other things that can cause the thyroid to be acting up, and so this is another reason why this is informational only and really, really good for you to discuss with an actual live human being who can check your labs if needed, if you're having these symptoms. And so one of the things that goes along with that is when the thyroid is overactive, it can do a whole range of things to the body. So we'll cover symptoms in just a minute. One of the things that is a issue is that when people are eating, as I said, this is a very meat, dairy, and fried processed food rich environment that we live in. And so some of the foods that people pick up at the grocery store, they have no idea that their food is coming with extra stuff in it. And some of the extra stuff can be bacteria. When I went to Dr. Greger's nutritionfacts.org to look for hyperthyroidism, there really wasn't a dedicated topic to that. There was mention of the Graves' disease, which is a disease where the body makes antibodies against the thyroid receptor. So basically, the thyroid has this receptor in it, and normally the brain is making this turn-on hormone called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. So basically the brain makes this thyroid stimulating hormone, it goes down to the thyroid, it binds to the receptor, and it causes the machinery to work and the thyroid to make its thyroid if things are working normally. So when the body creates an antibody against that receptor, essentially it's saying, oh my gosh, look at that protein, it looks dangerous, I better attack it, right? And so these antibodies come along and they bind to it, and then they turn on the machinery. And in the case of this autoimmune hyperthyroidism, basically the thyroid's not being stimulated by the brain, it's being stimulated by all these antibodies attacking these receptors. What we wonder is sometimes, well, how on earth did the body confuse that receptor with something it should be attacking, like a bacteria? Well, it turns out that in pork, it's very common that there's a bacteria called Yersinia enterocolitica. And I'm getting this reference directly from Dr. Greger's nutritionfacts.org. This is the one spot in the entire website where Graves' disease is mentioned. But basically what he's saying is there are about 100,000 Americans that are sickened by this foodborne pathogen. So basically this bacteria that is commonly found in the pork products. About 100,000 Americans get sick from this every year, and they get all sorts of GI symptoms: fever, belly pain, bloody diarrhea. Sometimes people think they're in so much pain they think they've got appendicitis, and they go off to the emergency room, very, very tender belly, and they think, oh my gosh, your appendix must be inflamed, and sometimes they have to get exploratory surgery only to find out, oops, wasn't your appendix, it was just a really, really bad GI bug. And when people have this, and they're saying that this particular bug seems to come over the last about 10 years, almost 100% of it was caused by contaminated pork products, or pig products essentially. And then when they tested pork samples across the country, one place, Consumers Union, found over 2/3 of those pork samples were contaminated with this bug, and of those, it just so happened that 90% of those were resistant to the antibiotics. So yes, people can get this really nasty GI symptoms from this Yersinia entobacteria, but over time, long-term consequences of this include chronic inflammation of the eyes, the kidneys, the heart, the joints sometimes, and within about a year, 47 times the risk of coming down with a autoimmune thyroid disease. 47 times the risk of coming down with the autoimmune arthritis, so basically joint disease. Sorry, I misspoke for a second there. And it was also postulated that the bacteria might play a role in triggering the autoimmune thyroid condition, Graves' disease, which is the main topic for tonight. So then he goes on to talk more about the things that are contributing to that bacteria. Why is it so widespread in our pork supply currently? Anywho, so the idea is that when people eat something and it really inflames the GI tract, it can cause the GI tract to become more leaky. And there's a lot of immune system patches that are lining the gut. So basically the intestines are there, and these immune system patches called Peyer's patches are sitting right next to that gut lumen. And so when there's something like a really nasty GI bug that's attacking the lining of the intestines and causing bloody diarrhea and all that stuff happens, this lining of the gut that's not supposed to let anything through unless it's really specifically meticulously transported in the ways that the body usually moves stuff from the gut to the bloodstream. If that lining is leaky, then sometimes the proteins that are in there get exposed accidentally, so to say, to those immune system patches that are sitting like right outside that gut lining. And so that seems to be the mechanism for some of these autoimmune diseases to happen, is that your body sees some little, protein, whether it's on that Yersinia bacteria, or whether it's a pork protein that manages to get its way through, and then the body says, oh my gosh, what is that, and basically starts to attack it. Well, the idea is that protein mimics the receptor that I was talking about in the thyroid, and so not only is it trying to attack that bacteria that was causing all that GI problems, well, now it says, oh wow, that looks like that bacteria that I was just attacking, and then it goes full force and starts to destroy the receptors, to the thyroid. So that's one mechanism by which this may happen, and the fact that this particular bacteria does really raise the risk of, within a year of a bout of Yersinia food poisoning, quoting directly from the transcript, victims at 47 times the risk of coming down with an autoimmune arthritis. So who knows? So there's a lot of things that can go along with arthritis, but certainly the mimicry is one thing that can go along with it. All right, so going into next, more about the symptoms of hyperthyroidism. Thank you, Joe. She's saying good information. All right, so hyperthyroidism, symptoms and risk factors. So now I'm moving into Dr. Barnard's review, nutritionmd.org, and basically 90-ish, my guesstimate, of times when somebody has hyperthyroidism, Graves' disease, that autoimmune, the immune system attacking that receptor, is the reason for it. Other causes can be, sometimes there's a nodule that might be, for example, a thyroid cancer or something that basically is doing its own thing and creating the hormones and wreaking havoc and all that sort of thing. Again, reasons why going to the live person and just double checking to see why and what's going on is very important, especially in the case of hyperthyroid. Basically, other reasons that it can go haywire, tumors of the thyroid, tumor of that pituitary gland. So I talked about the boss hormones coming from the brain, that TSH. Well, let's pretend that you got a tumor up inside the brain that's cranking out a ton of that TSH hormone. Well, what's that going to do to the thyroid? The thyroid is going to be, okay, boss, go, I'm on it. You know, it's going to pour out, too much thyroid hormone. There's a few other things. Occasionally people will be taking thyroid pills for one reason or another. Sometimes people think, well, if the thyroid controls metabolism, controls weight gain and weight loss, and I'm a little overweight and I really want to lose weight, sometimes they try to take a little extra of the thyroid medicines, which is really not very good for your bones or your body or anything, which we'll cover in a second. And then there's other things that can cause issues. Sometimes the thyroid gland itself gets inflamed and sometimes can go hyper, hypo, hyper, hypo, hyper, hypo. Sometimes that happens as well. And then other kinds of autoimmune diseases, the rule of thumb is if somebody has antibodies against one part of the body, it's very common that they get antibodies against another part of the body. So if you're a person with type 1 diabetes, for example, the likelihood of getting an autoimmune Graves' disease or other autoimmune disease tends to be a little bit higher as well. There is a type of thyroid storm that can happen. So basically this is the severe form, which can be very dangerous. So yes, Hashimoto's is that sometimes that up and down kind of thing. The Hashimoto's, Joe, is where instead of the antibodies attacking that thyroid receptor and stimulating the thyroid, the antibodies are attacking the product of the thyroid, essentially, for the most part, in that Hashimoto's. And sometimes it can kind of attack the thyroid gland itself as well. So more on that if you check out last week's lecture. All right, so thyroid storm. So if the thyroid is going completely haywire, and if the thyroid is basically churning out a ton of hormones for one reason or another, it can be a storm or really severe hyperthyroidism. So sometimes that happens if people get surgery on the thyroid, really bad stress like an infection, trauma, or surgery of a different body part, an overdose of iodine. So if somebody has a little bit of hyperthyroidism in the first place, and then they take one of those iodine supplements, last week I showed my friend's Lugol solution that she happened to have handy. And so that can cause extreme fever. So think fevers of 104 to 106 degrees Fahrenheit, severe nauseas, vomiting, jaundice. Basically, that's where like everything starting at the eyeballs turns yellow. Agitation, delirium, and sometimes seizures, coma, death. And so that is very rare, thankfully. But if somebody is starting to get really high fevers and some of those other factors, emergency room for sure. All right, back to regular hyperthyroidism. So symptoms of hyperthyroid are the opposite of low thyroid, so hypothyroid. So with a hyperthyroid, you get fast heart rate, the heart beating funny and fast, or palpitations, heat intolerance. So when people have low thyroid, they're always shivering and kind of cold. When people have hyperthyroid, man, they're hot in any situation. Weight loss. This is a relatively common cause of weight loss in some older folks as well. Menstrual irregularity. So basically anything to do with this endocrine axis, including low or high thyroid function, can make the periods go wonky, is the short version of that. So menstrual irregularities, nausea, vomiting, very restless, sometimes insomnia can go along with it, anxiety, and tremors. There's a basic tremor that everybody has just a little tiny bit. Well, hyperthyroid can exaggerate that as well. And so sometimes people also will get a goiter or a lump in the neck. Sometimes in Graves' disease, people can get drooping eyelids and bulging eyes. I can't really demonstrate here, but basically you can actually kind of see it in a person if it's not been diagnosed. Basically their eyeballs look like they're kind of bulging out a little bit, and has to do with basically this depositation of stuff behind the eyeballs that pushes them a little bit forward, and thickening and redness of the legs as well. Risk factors: women, we tend to be more at high risk for pretty much autoimmune diseases in general, and certain genetic things tend to go along with it. So how do we diagnose this? The main thing is history and a physical exam, feel in the neck for those goiters and lumps and bumps. The main thing really is blood testing. So you got to pull some blood, check the thyroid to see, all right, what's out of whack, and sometimes other things can be checked as well. But for the most part, when you pull a thyroid stimulating hormone or a TSH lab, which is the brain, the boss hormone, trying to do this, when the thyroid is really pumping out the juice, when it's really pumping out the thyroid hormones, that boss hormone, remember that boss hormone's like laying on the beach, taking a break, and that level usually is very low, abnormally low in the face of a high thyroid hormone kind of thing. So that's basically the way that is diagnosed and tested. And there's a lot of different kinds of things we use to treat it. Sometimes we'll give beta blockers, which is a kind of a blood pressure medication that slows down those heart palpitations. There's different kinds of medications that are used to target the thyroid. Methimazole is one, and usually these things are, if there's a primary care physician who's very familiar with it, sometimes they will go ahead and start these things, but a lot of times we refer these out to endocrinology or ENT, depending on what's going on. But the real definitive therapy, if you've got this hyperthyroidism going on, and it's, other stuff is ruled out, like they do an ultrasound or something to make sure there's not like a tumor doing that thing as well. Basically, there's a radioactive iodine. So as I talked about last week, the thyroid tissue here is one of the most specific tissues that soaks up that iodine from our food and environment. And because it is so darn specific, medically we take advantage of that. And so if you take iodine and lace it with a radioactive isotope, basically a fluid that has that radioactive iodine in it, then the person eats that or does it IV or however they do it these days, and it's measured to give you the right dose. Basically the thyroid will soak that up, and then you basically are walking around with a slightly radioactive thyroid for a while, and basically that will go ahead and kill off the thyroid tissues that are overactive. There's a few things you got to know when you are doing that therapy. Usually they'll tell people to avoid foods that contain any kind of iodine for some time before they do the therapy. Sometimes they'll do a surgery, that sort of thing. But basically the main thing that I remember from my days of treating that is you don't want to be holding babies or hanging around young kids during that time, because if they reach up and give you a hug when you've got a radioactive iodine-laced thyroid, then you could potentially give other people a little dose of radiation from that. So anyway, obviously these are considerations you would if needed, learn at the time of treatment. And sometimes people also surgically remove the thyroid as well. You can sometimes see a little tiny smile-shaped scar at the lower part of the neck where they kind of go up and in and surgically remove the thyroid. So that's usually used when people have a goiter as well, although not necessarily. And so the idea is you kill off the thyroid, whether you cut it out or whether you're doing it radioactively. The thyroid tissue is then essentially destroyed, and then people have to take thyroid hormones for the rest of your life, because when you destroy the worker, you become hypothyroid. So we call that iatrogenic hypothyroidism, which is a big fancy word for saying the doctors did it to me. Iatrogenic just means medically induced, medically caused. Alrighty. So, and then that thyroid storm that I mentioned, of course, the treatments for that are very similar to that for the low thyroid, or the hyperthyroid, but much higher medication doses and much closer monitoring. And usually people are in the intensive care unit when they have that. So, as I mentioned, rare, but if somebody happens to have it, it's pretty serious. All right, last but not least, a little word on nutritional considerations. So obviously kind of towards the beginning, when talking about ways to potentially help prevent people from getting sensitized to this in the first place, we talked about avoiding food poisoning from this Yersinia bacteria, which essentially is found in many, many pork samples across the country. Another reason to fully cook pork, if you're still imbibing in that substance, of course. Highly recommend whole food plant-based diet. Avoid a lot of these bugs. Anyway, so celiac disease. So as mentioned earlier, when people have one autoimmune disease, it's very common that the body gets sensitized to other things out there. So celiac disease is essentially where the body develops antibodies against wheat gluten. So when people with celiac disease eat wheat or gluten-containing foods, basically their entire gut lining says, "Oh my God, foreign invader," and starts attacking and can cause bloody diarrhea and all sorts of nastiness. But basically, individuals with celiac disease have a higher risk of developing that Graves' disease or autoimmune thyroiditis, where the body's attacking those receptors. And so there was, as Dr. Barnard found, there was some evidence saying maybe hyperthyroidism might be improved a little bit with a gluten-free diet. And then the other thing is that when people are diagnosed with hyperthyroidism, they might consider doing a brief trial of avoiding foods that are rich in iodine. So the foods that contain higher concentrations of iodine include iodinized salt. As mentioned last week, there was a movement to put iodine in the salt, major salt brands across the country. That way, the likelihood of pregnant women giving birth to children that were too low in iodine in the first place, that risk is a little bit lower because we supplement our salt with iodine. Sea salt also contains a lot of iodine. As well as seafood, dairy products, eggs, and foods that contain iodinates, iodate, alginates, carrageenan, which is sometimes found in some artificial products, agar, and red dye number 3. So those foods that I just listed out here are ones that particularly contain high concentrations of iodine. Now, I give that just because I'm mentioning it from Dr. Barnard's article, which I'll link below in the references section after we finish the talk. But again, a trial period off of those foods may be helpful, mostly in terms of avoiding that thyroid storm, especially before you get on to the definitive treatments like that methimazole or radioactive iodine or thyroid surgery or something like that. I would not recommend using food alone to control hyperthyroidism, mostly because it can cause a lot of problems over time. If that thyroid hormone is too high for too long, in addition to causing all those lovely symptoms mentioned before, also can have an impact on the strength of the bones and all sorts of other issues with the body. So although a autoimmune controlling diet can be very helpful in many cases, this is one of those cases where personally I would not recommend leaning entirely on that, mostly because we don't have enough research to support that, and we have some other treatments that are extremely easy to undergo. Not that anyone really likes the thought of ingesting, radioactive materials or something, and the other medications do, of course, have some side effects as well, like the methimazole. But the downside is if the thyroid is not taken care of in those cases, then seizures, coma, death, that's not too fun either. So I don't recommend going there. But as it were, taking good care of yourself in general helps prevent the body from developing many of these problems and diseases in the first place. And so please be mindful that if you're continuing to have this Western high-fat, high-meat, high-dairy kind of lifestyle, then you're not just eating the pork, you're also eating whatever that animal was exposed to, whether it's in the form of the antibiotics or the various kinds of things that are given to them to fatten them up faster and all that kind of stuff. And of course the bacteria that aren't necessarily tested for in those food samples. So in addition to pork tapeworms and other loveliness that can go on with some of these foods, the bacteria can potentially trigger other conditions as well. Alrighty, so since these broadcasts are happening down here in sunny Florida today, and next week there's a maybe hurricane, who knows where that hurricane may land, so there's a good chance that I may not be broadcasting next week. I might be taking some time to get ready for whatever the weather is going to bring. So if I don't see you next week, then hopefully we'll see you a couple weeks from now. And if the weather is beautiful and clear and no problems with the Wi-Fi or the internet connectivity, and then we'll see you next week. Alrighty, have a good day, and I hope you enjoyed your Labor Day holiday. Thank you for joining me again. Bye-bye.